And what's key to this clarification, I think, is the distinction between epistemic and pragmatic reasons. So in light of this distinction, I'll first specify the role of fiction in this account. And my take is to downgrade the role, and the notion is just as a heuristic function. And then the paper goes on to assess would-be fictionalist projects in the light of this clarification. To my mind, a genuine fictionalist account needs to provide some independently identifiable benefit. So then I look at a case study of a would-be fictionalist account that fails to meet this condition. And finally, this finding is generalized when I look at the prospects of a fictionalist account of philosophical theories. So that's our agenda. Okay, so let's start by considering an illustration of what I have in mind by a fictionalist account. By my reckoning, Popper was a fictionalist in his attitude to tested but unrefuted scientific theories. So he agreed with Hume that scientific theories can't have any degree of justification, and consequently he agreed with Hume that belief that any given scientific theory is true can't have any degree of justification. Okay, so what attitude did Popper think we should take to scientific theories which have passed all attempts to refute them, but are still available for scientific use? He talks of accepting such theories, where to accept a theory isn't to judge it true or probable or more probable than a rival theory, but rather, quote, to select as worthy to be subjected to further criticism and to the severest tests we can devise. So for Popper, there are no epistemic reasons for using scientific theory, i.e. for drawing predictions from that theory. Instead, there may be pragmatic reasons for using such a theory which hasn't failed severe test, is worthy of further testing, and thereby continuing the scientific enterprise. So the goal of science
You're talking
is to
about Popper, Karl Popper.
Yeah, Karl Popper.
Okay.
Yeah. So the goal of science is to falsify theories by observation, and further testing theories which have survived repeated testing is a means to that end. That's Popper's story. So with this illustration in place, we can see how the fictionalist meets an objection from Putnam. So Putnam criticized the fictionalist for seeking to separate the grounds which make it rational to accept a proposition P from the grounds which make it rational to accept P is true. He goes on to say that we can't separate these grounds, and he concludes that given considerations that make it rational to accept a theory, at least for scientific purposes, what further reasons could one want before one regards it as rational to believe a theory? Well, I think we've got the materials to see how Popper, as I see him, Popper the fictionalist, would respond. He'd agree that where P is a scientific theory, the grounds which make it rational to accept P are grounds which make it rational to accept P is true. But for Popper, accepting a theory isn't to believe a theory, and Putnam is just eliding those attitudes. Putnam rhetorically asks, what further reasons could one want before one regarded it as rational to believe a theory? Well, I think Popper's got an answer to that. We would want inductive reasons, but Hume showed that we can't have them. And that's why it's never rational to believe a scientific theory. Okay. So I've drawn on this distinction between epistemic and pragmatic reasons. What more can be said about it? So epistemic reasons for P concerns whether you should believe that P. Pragmatic reasons for P don't. They concern whether P's got payoff, confer a practical advantage. So to assess P in terms of epistemic reasons is to assess it in terms of the norm of truth. To assess it in terms of pragmatic reasons is to assess it in terms of some other norm, particularly a norm about means-end reasoning. And I think the folk, people in the street, non-philosophers are familiar with this distinction in so many words, they distinguish between a conviction politician and an opportunistic politician. They both promote certain propositions. They both endorse certain propositions. One does so in terms of what they actually believe, another one in terms of what's convenient for them for furthering their purposes. So that would illustrate a distinction between epistemic reasons and pragmatic reasons, between belief and acceptance. Following on from Putnam, Crispin Wright tries to undermine the fictionalist when she draws this distinction between epistemic and pragmatic reasons. So the fictionalist takes her target discourse to be governed by a subsidiary norm concerning pragmatic reasons. But then Wright asks, why in that case, truth or sentences of the discourse wouldn't be better explained in terms of satisfaction of the subsidiary norm, rather than in terms which motivate the charge of global error. So there his thinking is that since there is this subsidiary norm which is available, why not assess discourse in terms of that, setting aside the more demanding norm in terms of truth? So that subsidiary norm then becomes the guiding norm for assessing that discourse. Why isn't that an option? Well, agreed it is an option, but it seems to me to be no news to the fictionalist. So the fictionalist will distinguish between truth and truth in a fiction. So take the case of Hartree Field and his fictionalism about mathematics. Field claims that it's true that there are no numbers. Sorry, it's false that there are numbers, but it's true in the fiction of mathematics that there are numbers. And truth in a fiction is governed by a norm of conservative extension. So Field there represents both an error theorist about mathematics. Mathematics is systematically false because it assumes an ontology, namely the numbers which don't exist. But we could distinguish between mathematical falsehoods and what the theory or the discourse of mathematics says. So the claim that 7 plus 5 is 12 is false, but in the fiction of mathematics, it's true. That's the idea. So the fictionalist has got the option of working with both norms of truth and of fictional truth, and she can impute global error in the target discourse and then deploy an ersatz notion of truth, the notion of truth in a fiction. I think what drives Wright in his criticism of fictionalism and of error theory is considerations to do with the principle of charity, a principle about how we should interpret the speech of others. But I doubt whether charity supports his view. So here's one statement of the principle of charity from Davidson. He says, in our need to make a speaker make sense, we will try for a theory that finds him consistent, a believer of truths and a lover of the good. All by our own lights, it goes without saying. So 2 points about how charity bears on true belief. First of all, if charity forbids the imputation of global error, that means it forbids supposing that most people have mostly false beliefs about most topics. But so understood, charity doesn't forbid most people having mostly false beliefs about certain topics, particularly philosophically problematic topics such as mathematics or morality, whatever the case may be. Second point is that how things are according to our lights is a context-dependent matter. And what are admissible as data in a philosophical disagreement will vary according to the disagreement in question. Well, here's an example. In a debate about free will, our various thoughts and intentions and decisions are shared data, and the question is just whether these are free. But in a debate about skepticism about other minds, these won't be available as data. A corollary is that what truths the folk can be taken to believe, given charity, will also be context dependent. It will partly depend on what, if any, philosophical dispute is in play. For what we entitled to take to be the data, what's philosophical common ground will shift according to what's under debate. So in Field's discussion of the reality of numbers, the data won't include the folk having non-vacuously true mathematical beliefs. So we need to resolve the debate to establish the truth about mathematics according to our own lights before we can settle which, if any, mathematical truths the folk might believe. What's more, this consideration about the context dependence of debates, I also think has got relevance in appeals to so-called Maurean facts to block revisionist philosophical theories. So here's David Lewis. He says, a Maurean fact is one of those things that we can know better than we know the premises of any philosophical argument to the contrary. So he, following G. Moore, wants to appeal to various Maurean facts to block various skeptical or theoretic views. So Maurean facts are at least common sense beliefs, but it's not clear to me that every common sense belief is a Maurean fact. The appeal to Maurean facts has an unflattering resemblance to Kipke's paradox of dogmatism. So his paradox goes, if I know the key, then any evidence to the contrary is misleading and should be rejected. So I thereby ought never to change my mind with respect to P. Moreover, Lewis's demanding characterization of a Maurean fact comes at a cost. It makes it doubtful whether there are any Maurean facts. So let's stipulate that a Bradleian argument is a philosophical argument that can't be undermined by any folk claim. An appeal to a Maurean fact blocks a philosophical argument only if that argument is not a Bradleian argument. So what assurance can Lewis have that a given philosophical argument is not a Bradleian argument, but is susceptible to being undermined by a Maurean fact? There's at least one Maurean fact, if and only if there are no Bradleian arguments. Okay, but what truth value should be assigned to both sides of that biconditional? Answering that kind of question requires going beyond a simple appeal to Maurean facts, and it involves re-engaging with philosophical debate, whereby all bets are off. Still, let's grant that there are Maurean facts. That concession leaves open the question of which Maurean facts obtain. Something's being a Maurean fact requires at least that it's a truth known by all the folk. So given my earlier claim about the context sensitivity of what truths the folks can be said to believe, which Maurean facts can be taken to obtain is going to vary from debate to debate. In a debate about the existence of mathematical facts, it won't be a Maurean fact that 7 plus 5 equals 12. Although it is a Maurean fact in a debate about, say, the existence of moral facts. So what can be taken to be known by the folk is going to vary according to the debate, and hence what can count as a Maurean fact is going to vary according to the debate. So the appeal to Maurean facts is thereby neutralized. Something's a Maurean fact only in a debate in which it's dialectically irrelevant. So even if a Maurean fact is a claim that can't be undermined by a philosophical argument, no Maurean fact would be relevant to any philosophical debate. Okay, with all that in place, let's turn to fictionalism. So part of my agenda was, as I say, kind of downgrading the role of the notion of fiction. Many fictionalists have it as key to their understanding of fictionalism that treating a theory of science or of mathematics or morality as a fiction, really does grossly employ the notion of a fiction, that's somehow indispensable in understanding what the fictionalist is up to. Hence, we get opponents of fictionalism like Burgess, who try to undermine the connection between what the fictionists are doing and what are fictions, what's characteristic of fiction, to try to wreck the project of fictionism. So I think fiction just is a heuristic notion. It's just a helpful analogy in explaining fictionalism. It's just a heuristic device for understanding the view, but is essential to characterizing it. The only point of similarity that we need to care about is that in treating a set of propositions as forming a fiction, we're not concerned with the truth values of those propositions. I think the analogy with fiction need go no further. And likewise with related ideas like pretense and make-believe and the like. None of these ideas need to be introduced to say what it is to be a fictionalist about a given discourse or a given theory. Some fictionalists think that this is mistaken, outrageous, heresy. So Azuni's warned that only when fiction or fictional elements genuinely play a role in an approach to a philosophical subject can that approach be described as fictionalist. Well, they don't invest very much in who gets to be called a fictionalist. I'd settle for another term if need be, like instrumentalist. But for what it's worth, it strikes me that there's historical precedent to my use of the label, to think that you can characterize a view as fictionalist without invoking the notion of a fiction. So roll the clock back to Copernicus. And Osiander's preface to Copernicus's On the Revolution of the Planets is widely taken to be representative of the prevailing fictionalism about astronomy. But it doesn't explicitly employ the notion of a fiction. Here's the relevant passage from Osiander's preface. He says, since the astronomer cannot in any way attain to the true causes, he will adopt whatever suppositions enable the motions to be computed correctly from the principles of geometry from the future as well as for the past. For these hypotheses need not be true nor even probable. On the contrary, if they provide the calculus consistent with the observations is enough. Okay, so that's a statement of Osiander's fictionalism about Copernicanism. No appeal there to the notion of a fiction. What have we got? There's the bit you believe, namely that there are planets and the sun. There's the bit you don't believe, that the planets orbit the sun. And then there's the payoff, a calculus consistent with observations which you wouldn't otherwise get. As I see it, the fictionist account has got three components. There's a problem, pragmatic policy, and a payoff. So here's how this plays out in the case of three examples, mathematics, morality, and science. So these are just three quick sketches. Mathematics. So there the problem is how to make scientific claims about the concrete world. The policy, which is accepted but not believed, is that there's a domain of sets which science quantifies over. And the payoff consists in novel but concise claims about the concrete world. Second, morality. The problem is how to motivate people to do socially useful things they're reluctant to do. The policy, accepted but not believed, is that those actions are morally prescribed. And the payoff is the performance of those actions. Third, science. The problem is that science talks of things we can't observe. The policy, accepted but not believed, is that there are such things, and the payoff is that we get to know more about what we can observe. How do we tell that these accounts have the promised payoffs? The payoffs are secured only if any policy can be set aside and the payoffs are independently identifiable. That's to say, you don't need the policy to say what the payoffs are and why they're payoffs. In the case of mathematics, the payoff is a dispensable shorthand language for talking about the concrete world. In the case of morality, the payoff consists in socially desirable actions which are not described in moral language, resisting harmful temptations, resolving social conflicts peacefully, and the like. And in the case of science, the payoff is more knowledge of observables. Now, I don't say that any of these three programs succeed, but I do say that they display the same necessary condition for the success of a fictionalist account of a given topic. Namely, that there's a payoff, that it's independently specifiable, that's to say, independently specifiable of the fictionist characterization of the topic. You can say why we would want to have that payoff, regardless of what the fictionist theory is. So here's where we've got to. If there aren't epistemic reasons supporting the propositions of a given topic, you don't need to believe those propositions. But if you use those propositions, you should have some pragmatic reasons for doing so. It's then fair to ask, what are those pragmatic reasons? What payoff do you expect from them? So that might seem quite a reasonable, even an innocuous requirement, that we can identify what the payoff is. I think that some fictionalist attempts fail to meet this condition. And one such is a proposed fictionalist account of metaphysical grounding. So let me say what the problem is that such an account is supposed to meet, and then say what the theory is and what its supposed payoffs are. So the problem an account of grounding is supposed to overcome is how certain phenomena are to be explained. So a non-empty set exists because its members exist. A disposition obtains because its standard categorical base obtains. An agent is morally good because she has certain natural properties. Problem, what relation is specified by this because? Well, it's not a causal relation. It's not a equivalence relation because we seem to have an asymmetry here. The disposition depends upon the categorical base, but the categorical base doesn't depend on the disposition. The non-empty set depends on the existence of its members. Its members don't depend for their existence on the set. So the thinking is that there is some other relation that's present, a relation of primitive metaphysical determination, such that the existence of what's grounded asymmetrically depends on what grounds it. If we understand what this doctrine is, what's been claimed there, fictionalism about grounding simply says it's a fiction that there is a grounding relation, and hence it's a fiction that this relation obtains in each of these examples. So it's a fiction that the non-empty set exists because its members exist. A fiction that the disposition obtains because its categorical base obtains, and so forth. So that might seem an attractive doctrine. Talk of grounding seems a metaphysically heavyweight notion. You might think it's remarkable that, or queer that such a thing should exist in the world. You might think there's a deep puzzle about how we could get to know where it is instanced. You might think then that grounding fictionalism is a particularly attractive subject because it can evade those kind of questions. So here's a position statement by one grounding fictionalist, Thompson. She says, the fictionalist can highlight the benefits of engaging in grounding talk. These benefits are wide-ranging. Grounding talk is simplifying and systematic. It allows us to formulate and to relate various established metaphysical principles, and it enables fruitful discussion of issues of philosophical interest. The recent burgeoning literature making use of grounding talk is at least a prima facie case for thinking that the introduction of grounding talk has enabled philosophical progress. Okay. Now, what should we make of this advertisement for grounding fictionalism? The claim that grounding talk is simplifying and systematic doesn't itself meet the condition of being a genuine payoff. So casting various established metaphysical principles in the language of grounding isn't a positive result unless grounding talk is beneficial in some way. So there was no benefit when Procrustes locked and stretched, making each guest the same size as his iron bed, unless there was something desirable or special about his bed size. Uniformity isn't an end in itself. The suggestion that grounding talk, quote, enables fruitful discussion of issues of philosophical interest seems to be only a way of restating the target claim that fictionalism about grounding has payoff. So one hypothesis is more fruitful than another. If the former generates more promising research projects, but then the question is exactly whether grounding talk generates promising research projects at all. That needs to be argued for, not simply asserted. Lastly, it may be true that the recent burgeoning literature makes use of grounding talk, but that doesn't answer the question, what's it all in aid of? You can only hope that it's something more than an exercise in group think. So those are my criticisms of that kind of position statement of grounding fictionalism. Superficially, various advantages are being appealed to or cited on its behalf in terms of uniformity, in terms of enabling a fruitful discussion of philosophical interest, and of that the recent burgeoning literature makes use of grounding talk. All of this seems to me to be evasion. None of this gives us a payoff, a benefit for engaging in grounding talk at all. So it's markedly unlike the cases of, say, morality or mathematics, where it seemed that fictionist projects could give us some genuine benefit, namely, in the case of fictionism about morality, that it would corral people to overcome, say, weakness of the will and do things they're inclined not to do. Or in the case of mathematics, it enables us to grind out results about the observable world, which we wouldn't get unless we use the language of mathematics. So lax standards about what counts as a benefit, as a payoff, gives the illusion that grounding fictionalism is promising. Lastly, I want to say something about the prospects for fictionalism about philosophical theories in general. So we might have thought that this was a viable option, that fictionalism holds out the prospects of philosophers freeing themselves of the difficulties of marshalling evidence for their theories. And then there's all the logjam of argument and counter-argument. So we could explore and develop theories without worrying about the bugbears of prosecution and defense. Why? Because we don't believe philosophical theories, we simply accept them. So I have to confess I'm very doubtful about this project. And my key concern is that, as I've said, I think fictionalism about a given topic or discourse needs to have some independently identifiable benefit. And in the case of fictionalism about a given philosophical theory, it's hard to see what that would be, not least because philosophical theories tend to lack utility. So I can't see what would be the benefit involved in accepting a philosophical theory in the fictionalist sense of the word accept. So just to take a step back and think about, say, Copernicus and Osiander. Okay, so there we've got philosophical theory, Osiander, and the discourse that it's about, what Copernicus is saying. It's the discourse which has payoff, not Osiander's philosophical theory. So Copernicus is a theory of astronomy. Osiander has a philosophical theory about Copernicus's theory. Copernicus's theory has payoff. Osiander's doesn't. It just shows what that payoff is. So, crucial thing with a fictionist treatment of a theory is that it has payoff whether or not the subject theory is true or not. So we can examine whether Copernicus's theory has payoff, whether or not it's true. In the case of a philosophical account of a philosophical theory, so a fictionist account of a philosophical theory, the stumbling block is whether that philosophical theory could have any payoff. That's to say, we could have any benefit, regardless of whether it's true. So if you're a fictionist about a philosophical theory, you'd be a fictionist, that's to say, you will not believe any of its claims to have solved a problem or to have explained some phenomenon or to have identified a new kind of entity. So none of those can count as payoffs. So the template of problem and policy and payoff doesn't apply. So I think that marks one of the limits of fictionalism. And there I'll stop. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, comments, questions?
I have a couple of questions if I can jump straight in. First of all, thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. And I just have to start off, I have a very general and maybe basic question. Namely, how do you understand the main motivation for fictionalism? Like, would you say that is it because it enables us to posit a more favorable ontology? Although based on your last couple of comments, maybe you wouldn't go in this direction? Or is it because the discourse of, say, mathematics is more fruitfully interpreted within a fictionalist framework? I think this would be the thesis of hermeneutical fictionalists, if I'm not mistaken. Or is it understood, purely in terms of the payoffs that you were talking about? So it's more of like a clarificatory question, I guess.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so there are different forms of fictionalism, as you say. There's hermeneutic as opposed to, say, revolutionary. And I wasn't trying to have a kind of an umbrella version of fictionalism which applies to all of them. I was just interested in marking out fictionalism of one important kind, I think. It's the kind which I think people like Field with his fictionalism about mathematics, or Joyce with his fictionalism about morality are engaged in. I mean, with the hermeneutic, you're concerned with really showing that the correct interpretation of the language we speak isn't what we naively thought it was. Okay, so that's in mind. Okay, so we're concerned with revolutionary fictionalism here. The motivation may shift depending on what the target discourse is. But as a rule of thumb, there's a concern about ontology and a concern about epistemology. So the worry about ontology would be that it's inflated, that you have to introduce surprising entities such as abstract objects or objective moral values, and puzzles about what those kinds of things could be. Then allied to that, I guess there would be epistemological worries about how we could have access to them. I mean, with Van Fraasen's concerns about scientific unobservables, the worry is that that can't be squared with being a good empiricist. Those strike me as stock motivations for being a fictionalist in the sense I'm concerned with.
Okay, thanks. And just one more question. So you were talking about, I don't know, the payoffs of, I don't know, grounding or the discourse of mathematics, right? And
Right.
so I'm just thinking if it maybe makes, I don't know, not necessarily more sense, maybe it will be more elegant to just adopt a pragmatist framework regarding truth if we start talking about payoffs of the, I know, discourse, for instance, of mathematics, because I have this feeling that fictionalism has a lot of, or not a lot of, it has certain, I was about to say that it has more theoretical baggage than a pragmatist account of truth, or, you know, or a framework within which we want to understand, for instance, mathematical truths. But this would probably be wrong. I just want to hear your opinion regarding, I don't know, maybe a pragmatist interpretation of, I don't know, mathematical discourse, because you were talking about payoffs, so this is
Yeah.
coming to my mind.
Yeah, well, I guess we need to know more about what you've got in mind by a pragmatic account of truth, and how you meet some of the kind of the stock worries about pragmatism about truth. Here's a kind of a middle ground. It would be nice to have a theory which was available to someone who wasn't a pragmatist about truth. Particularly, there seem to be a lot of deflationists about truth around, people who don't think that truth is an epistemic or a pragmatic notion, who think it's primitive. In this case, your option isn't going to be available to them, but the fictionalist option would. So there might be bigger issues, I agree, about the defensibility of, or what the right account of truth is. Yeah, maybe if the pragmatic truth turns out to be the pragmatic notion of truth turns out to be the winner, we could go down that road. Otherwise, fictionalism is there for those who don't want to go down that route. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. So
Yeah, it does.
I feel so kind of ironic. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I'm gonna have to think about it a little bit more, but yeah, thanks for now.
If I may jump in. So, Chris, at the end of
Yeah.
your talk, if I got you right, so you said that, well, about fictionalism, about philosophical theories. Okay, so your point was that philosophical entities or theories, they don't have explanatory value. Since they don't have explanatory value, we don't have pragmatic reasons to accept philosophical theories in a fictionalist sense. Was that the argument or something like that?
Yeah, I didn't appeal to claims about explanation. I didn't say they didn't have explanatory value. I just said, yeah, they don't have utility. They don't have any kind of pragmatic payoff, which anyone could recognize as being beneficial. Like scientific theories, of course, which, you know, whether they're true or not, can be used for making predictions and steering us around the world. That was the thought.
Well, so I was thinking about, I don't know, universals or bare particulars or the
Yeah.
ontological entities. So it seems to be plausible to be fictionalist about such entities. And however, we can argue that they are useful they are useful, intellectually useful, that we can maybe, in a sense, explain things or classify things, or that it is intellectually useful to assume that there are such entities and further plausible to be fictionist about them. So,
Well, yeah, so that's useful in talking about history, the history of philosophy and ideas and things. But I was thinking, does it have any payoff outside of that? So, I mean, talking about, say, neutrons and electrons can be stimulating in the scientific community. But what's more than that, it can be used to make predictions about what we can observe and what we get under certain, observable conditions. With the philosophical theory, we have nothing like that.
okay, maybe these ontological weird entities not, but say that somebody argues that there is no such thing as sin, as moral sin. Oh, come on, it's a fiction. There is only a set of social norms that what we expect others to do and what we expect others to blame us and so on. So, but there is no such thing as a sin. So since there are social mechanisms and expectations, so on, it is useful to believe that there is a sin, that there is such a thing as a sin.
Yeah, that's pretty much what you've got with Richard Joyce and his take on morality. I mean, for sin, read moral good or moral evil. So there you can deploy certain ideas to have certain social benefits. Agreed.
In ethics,
Yeah, ethics, right.
our argument is about free will. So we will never find out whether we have or don't have free will, but it is a good thing to believe that we do, because we will be more active, more responsible, and so on. So one might say that free will is useful fiction because it moves us.
Yeah, I mean, you could certainly take that line. I mean, I know that Weichinger did. Yeah, and I guess it would be a piece with fictionalism about morality. As I say, I'm not trying to judge whether any of these projects are successful, but I just want to say that they do pass one important test, namely that they have a benefit, a payoff, independent of the fictionalist account. So you could see why we would want to use these notions.
Sorry for misusing my position. Might formulate a dilemma like this. Let's take these weird ontological entities, quintessence, pair particulars, whatever. So if they do have explanatory power, if they explain something, then they must be real. Then we cannot be fictionist about that. On the other hand, if they don't explain anything, we don't have reason even to be fictionist. So there is no place for fictionists. Either we will accept these entities or we will not accept these entities. There is no point in being fictionist about it.
Well, I mean, one thing the fictionists can cast their net a bit wider. They can be fictionist about the actual explanations given.
About full explanation.
Well, about those explanations. So the moral fictionist will presumably be a fictionist about explanations about claims of the form that it was the rank injustice of a certain situation, say transatlantic slave trade, which made people abandon it. So it wasn't an explanation that they think is going to be true and is impositing real entities, because they don't believe the explanation either. And I think it's also there's an issue about the nature of explanation. There are theories out there that understand explanation as not as ontologically committal, but as, I don't know, invoking certain kind of pragmatic considerations. So I think there's room for maneuver for the fictionalists there about what they think explanations do and whether explanations need to be believed.
Thank you. Further questions, comments?
So if I can just circle back to the issue of the utility or lack thereof of philosophical theories if we try to interpret them within a fictionalist framework, right? So if I understood you correctly, one of the reasons why we're not necessarily interested in applying fictionalism to philosophical theories is because there is no utility to be gained from this. Okay, so
Yeah.
I was wondering, I didn't work on this a couple of years, but the doctrine of Pyrrhonian skepticism, right? So Sextus Empiricus, etc. Like, they would probably be fine with you taking a fictionalist stance towards their doctrine, and they would still insist that you would have a very tangible benefit or utility from it, because like as they would claim that as opposed to the dogmatic, we practice a suspension of belief, which leads us one step closer towards eudaimonia, right? So it does not cause us so much stress as, the amount of stress that the dogmatic has to go through in, defending his or her beliefs, etc. So I'm not sure, maybe this is a little bit too far-fetched, but would you say that perhaps, Pyrrhonian skepticism would get away with, I don't know, having fictionalism applied to their doctrines and still having a tangible benefit or utility after the fact?
Urban skepticism, not the rural one.
Yeah. Again, I would have to work a little bit more on the articulation because it was a couple of years since I worked on Pyrrhonian skepticism, but I think they would be on board with such an interpretation, I think.
They're interesting. They had interesting views about belief. What is belief? What does it mean to believe in something? Please, Chris.
Yeah, so from what I know about it, it's not that that form of skepticism confers that benefit. But they thought that, yeah, if you actually believed their doctrine, it would have a certain benefit. So the belief has a kind of a psychological arm, I suppose, that it makes you feel better about your life and your state of ignorance. Well, yeah, so the operative thing there isn't that whether or not the theory is true or false, it has a certain benefit. But if you believe the theory, then it has a benefit. That's not surprising with many philosophical theories. If you actually believe them, it may have a certain psychological benefit or not. So if I don't know if you claim to believe moral nihilism, perhaps that would have a very depressing impact on you. But it wouldn't be whether or not moral nihilism was true or false as a benefit. That's a different kind of issue being raised here, whether you believe a particular theory would have a benefit or a disbenefit.
Yeah, again, I would have to look up the texts, but I think the Pyrrhonian skeptic would be quite, he would stand his ground in the sense that he would insist that he, as a matter of fact, does not hold any beliefs, not even regarding the doctrine espoused by, I don't know, Sextus Empiricus, etc. I think they would use the term that they are following the senses, or not the senses, the Professor Berčić, how do we translate pojave into English?
Appearance.
Appearances. Yeah, I think the Pyrrhonian
Okay.
skeptic would insist that they are not, as a matter of fact, holding beliefs, but that they are merely following the appearances. This is, another can of worms. And again, I should look up the text, but I think they would try to avoid talk about beliefs and would rather replace it with, talk about following the appearances. So I'm not sure if this is, a viable answer that you would be satisfied with, but I think a Pyrrhonian skeptic would go down that route.
That's actually this Descartes' temporary morality. So that we behave as if we believe in the external world, but we don't.
Yeah, more or less, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can only kind of repeat what I've said. It's not in question that having certain beliefs or attitudes towards philosophical theories can be beneficial or disbeneficial. The fictionalist attitude is about whether the theory, whether it's true or whether it's false, irrespective of people's psychology, would confer certain benefits. That's the thinking.
Okay, yeah, I get it. Yeah, I think that should be a valid answer. Again, I'm gonna think about it, but yeah, I like it's interesting, yeah.
So further, Vito, Danica.
Yeah, I have a question. I was thinking all the time about something I stumbled upon when I read some stuff in philosophy of biology. So biologists usually talk a lot about information, biological information, communication talk, and like signals. I don't know, the DNA is a book of life, and we have transcriptions, translations, and so on. And so there's one philosopher, Arnon Levy, who holds that actually this information talk is kind of a fiction that we use to better understand what's happening in biology, and to better understand and to kind of explain what's happening, like what's this at the, let's say, ontological level, what's happening at the ontological level. So I don't know, what's your take on that? Fictions as something useful, I guess, to better understand and explain true facts in biology.
Yeah, I don't know enough about the subject to comment. I know there's been debates about the notion of species and whether that should be treated as a class or an individual, or I guess treated in some kind of fictional way. Really will be for the scientists themselves to decide what they want to treat as fictions and what not. I don't think it's the philosophers who have the authority to comment on these issues beyond general concerns, say, about observability and the like, which Larson has.
Yeah, maybe this interesting case whether DNA, which is a chain of molecules, contains information that seems to be metaphorical speech.
Mm.
That was what you had in mind.
Yeah. So this fictional account proposed by this philosopher is about how, yeah, information and actually all this communication talk is basically some kind of a metaphor for something that's really going on at this biological level. So that's basically his take. Yeah.
Yeah. Dawkins talk about memes. That seems very congenial for a fictionist treatment. If you think that, yeah, it's just a kind of a metaphor for talking about how ideas get transmitted through culture in something like the way that genes are supposed to get transmitted down generations.
Well, I have another one. So we are talking about how useful theories are, how useful fictions are. But pragmatic cases of fictions are games like chess or cards, and they are not useful. Maybe they don't have any consequences in real life. So maybe we should kind of treat them separately, theories, scientific theories, philosophical theories, and games on the other hand.
Yeah, right. I mean, I mentioned in passing in the paper that Prager said, yeah, the only difference between chess and mathematics is arithmetic. I think he mentioned arithmetic has application, which is exactly your point.
So if fictionalism fits well for chess and cards, then it seems that there is no some pragmatic consequences play a role in accepting. We all are fictions about knights, kings, aces, queens in chess, so on. But so these examples of games, they show that we are and can be, and we are fictionists without any pragmatic, without being useful, without any use.
Yeah, I would beware of using the term fiction both to describe what I'm concerned with and what's going on with games. As I say, I don't set any kind of particular store in the notion of a fiction. I just might want to introduce what these accounts are like. So I think there may well be dissimilarities between things like reading novels, playing games, and what these philosophers are up to when they're fictionists about a given theory. In my mind, it's worth being a fictionist about a given theory if you can show that that theory has some kind of payoff, whether or not that theory is true. That's the kind of consideration that I think is salient, and it doesn't really carry over to things like games or novels, where there isn't a question of whether the game is true or false. That kind of question doesn't really arise.
Further questions, comments? Danica, are you a fictionalist about something?
No, but I do have one short explanatory question. Under this framework of yours, does Harty-Field's nominalism qualify as epistemically or pragmatically motivated, or both?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to say both. So the epistemic motivation is that he thinks if numbers are real, it's very hard to see how we could have knowledge of them, given that they're abstract, i.e. not in space and time, and how could we have any kind of reliable correlation to facts about mathematics? And then, yeah, again, the pragmatic element is there because he thinks adopting the fiction of mathematics enables us to do science more easily. That's what it really comes down to. That in principle, science can be done without appealing to mathematics, but using mathematics enables us to get all the claims about the concrete world by a kind of a shortcut. So yeah, there are both epistemic and kind of practical elements to what he's on about. So I guess, yeah, given the epistemological worry, there's the question, why carry on doing mathematics? And there's his story that enables us to say things about the concrete world, which would be a very difficult and long-winded way of doing if we didn't appeal to mathematics. Does that answer your question? Yeah. And I think what goes for Field goes also, say, for Joyce and Mackie about morality. There are these worries about what the domain of morality is about, but they want to make use of its benefits in some pragmatic way.
Mackie and who is other guy?
Joyce, Richard Joyce.
Oh, we.
Yeah, Joyce has got a book, or several books defending not just an error theory about morality, but a fictionalist treatment of morality. So I think there's sorry.
So the name is Joyce.
Joyce, yeah, Richard Joyce. Richard Joyce.
We were mentioning knowledge. And in a sense, we cannot have mathematical knowledge because numbers do not exist. So there can be knowledge, but intuitively, I would think that we would say that there is knowledge about chess, that some people have a lot of knowledge about chess and that they are skillful and so on. Although figures of chess are, of course, non-existent.
So what's the kind of contrast between mathematics and chess that you want? What are you thinking here?
We can have knowledge in chess, and we can have knowledge in mathematics as well. Although these entities do not exist.
Yeah, so in chess, what are the entities that don't exist? I mean, we get the pieces on the board. In mathematics, the claim is, well, we don't have the relevant entities.
No, intuitively, I would say that somebody knows that queen moves straight and diagonal, and that one knows that 5 and 7 makes 5.
Yeah, so I guess is what do you think the mathematics is committed to and what you think the chess is committed to? So, I mean, Field's take is that in the case of mathematics, it's committed to there being numbers, which he thinks are problematic. In the chess case, what's it committed to? It's about where pieces on the board can be moved to. So there might be a philosophical worry about the mathematical case that you don't have in the chess case.
About both, we can talk as concrete entities as well as abstract entities. In chess, we can talk, the queen in chess can have in mind concrete entity on the board, and we can have in mind, say, abstract entity in the game.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess if you want to press that kind of line, then yeah, fictionism about chess would kick in. That um, if it if the rule books purport to be talking about these abstract things, chess positions and chess moves, then in that case, it has to be treated as a fiction. So what people know is that in the fiction of chess, uh, you should get your knights out early or something like that. Likewise, in the fiction of mathematics, it's 2 plus 7 plus 5 is 12. So there would be a parallel between the two cases, given that chess is a game about abstract positions.
Yeah, and
Yeah, and abstract pieces. Yeah, fair enough.
please further, Matija, Vito, Danica.
Yeah, I have a question. So, if I remember correctly, at one or at several points rather, you have mentioned that in the fictionalism you were talking about today, that you would avoid talking about, I don't know, pretending that P or make
Make-believe.
believe,
Yeah.
etc. Okay. So
Mm.
would you then rather talk about, so for instance, Mark Gallagher, when he talks about fictionalism for the discourse of mathematics, he claims, for instance, that he does not say that we are pretending that, I don't know, 7 plus 5 equals 12. He claims that, I don't know, our mathematical theories are for all practical purposes true. Would you accept this kind of formulation, or would this be more, I don't know, accessible, not accessible, but more, I don't know, friendly to your position, or what would you think of it?
No, it kind of goes back in my answer to your earlier question that I kind of would be wary of buying into a pragmatic account of truth, or this phrase about truth for practical purposes. Not really clear what I'd be buying into in using these notions. So, as I say, I want to use notions which I think are sort of quite familiar to us and hopefully not too problematic, really about belief and about believing that pursuing a certain means gets you to a certain end, which is where the notion of pragmatic reason comes in. So those are kind of the operative notions I want to use. So I'm not saying that Mark is wrong, but I'm just saying that this is the kind of the stall that I'm setting out, trying to understand fictionalism in terms of this split between epistemic and pragmatic reasons, but not trying to bring in special pragmatic notions like a pragmatic notion of truth or truth for practical purposes. Those notions aren't quite as clear as I'd like. So I'd want to distance myself from them.
Yeah, and so this basically goes right back to the claim that you're using, I don't know, talk about fiction merely as a heuristic of sorts, I guess.
Yeah, because I guess, yeah, the phrase is out there, it's associated with a certain approach. I'm trying, I guess, to salvage it. I mean, if someone got very possessive about the term fictionalism and said, you can't be a fictionist unless the notion of fiction is central to your account, I'd be happy to back off. I mean, there's a term like instrumentalism, which could be used in its place. But as I said, with the case of Osiander, there seems to me to be good historical precedent for thinking at least one approach in this broad program of fictionalism works along the kind of lines I suggest.
Yeah, Osiander is usually taken as instrumental.
Yeah. And as I say, there's no explicit mention of fiction there. So
Well, mentioned, but that
I kind of feel that people have got a bit sidelined by talking about fiction and, as I say, issues about fiction and fictional truth in trying to understand some of these issues. And there's a kind of a notion of a way of explaining what fictionalism is, where the notion of fiction is kind of quite incidental.
So just to wrap this up, so would you agree that there are basically no parallels between, I don't know, the talk that is going on within, I don't know, the framework of a novel, for instance, I know Anna Karenina or something like that. So there are no parallels between talking within the framework of a novel and on the one hand, and on the other hand, talking within the framework of mathematics. Would you say that there are like no parallels between these two kinds of talk? Or I guess you would say that maybe through the lens of utility, of some possible utility, that this would be like a parallel. I'm not sure if I posed the question.
No, that's a good question. Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm going to say there may be parallels, but I'm going to say it's not important for you to understand what it is to be a fictionalist about mathematics. I mean, put it this way, if you had a culture where they didn't have a fiction at all, they had no novels, no games, you could explain to them what it is to be a fictionalist about mathematics in the kind of the terms I've presented. So, yeah, there may be parallels, but I don't think they are needed for saying what is distinctive about a fictionalist approach as opposed to a realist approach to a given topic. I mean, someone asked me, well, do I think that there's some kind of phenomenological similarity between, consuming fiction and accepting, in the fictionalist sense, a theory? My move there is to say, well, it's not clear to me that there is any particular phenomenology to fiction. I mean, you can read a novel and be engrossed in it, read it and be fairly bored. It's not clear to me that there's a distinctive phenomenology to experiencing fiction. But even if there was a phenomenological similarity between the two cases, that's really neither here nor there. As I say, it seems to me to be something incidental for the purposes of understanding fictionalism about topics.
Yeah, thanks. And I really like this move because I think that severing the parallels between, I don't know, story talk and I don't know, discourse within mathematics saves a lot of time and energy for the fictionalist in answering some criticisms. I'm not going to go into much depth, but I think a lot of people tried to levy certain types of criticism by showing that we cannot draw a parallel between, I don't know, story talk on the one hand and, mathematical discourse on the other. So I think I actually very much like your project because I think it is a very elegant solution to a certain type of criticism levied against the fictionalist. So yeah, I'm gonna think about it a little bit more, but I do like it.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, just in the long version of the paper, I have a kind of a little subsection where I push back at criticisms by John Burgess of exactly these alleged parallels. And I think he could be criticized in his own terms because I think what he says about fiction can't be isn't generalized. It just applies to particular examples. But yeah, the more important point, I think, is that whether or not the parallels are or not is neither here nor there. The project of fictionalism really doesn't depend on finding these parallels and making them robust. So, yeah.
Well, one more question. At the beginning of your talk, you're talking about epistemic aspects, and there was a distinction between belief that P and belief that P is true.
Yeah.
On one hand, I have a feeling that I know what are you up to. There's a good example with these two politicians. But On the other hand, it's conceptual truth about belief, that to believe that P is to believe that P is true. So how can you work truth?
Yeah, no, I can accept the conceptual point, and I wanted to affirm that in the paper. To believe P is to believe that P is true. With the politicians example, the point was that you can have two individuals, both, let's say, endorsing or accepting a certain claim. One of them who genuinely believes it, the other one who is uttering it without believing it, but for some ulterior purpose. That was the thinking there. And it was a way of illustrating a difference between epistemic reasons and pragmatic reasons. So the conviction politician has got an epistemic reason, and she really believes what she says. The opportunistic politician does not believe it, but has pragmatic reasons for uttering that claim or accepting it, where to accept isn't to believe. Yeah.
It was in 50s in ethical literature, inverted commas sense. So that I say that inverted comma sense, I say the something good, although I don't really believe it, but I say it in the sense that majority of people believe it. So is X good? Yes, it is good. And so I can give that answer in the inverted commas sense, in the sense that X is usually regarded as good, although I personally don't care about it.
Okay, yeah. Okay, you might say, I'm not speaking for myself. Most people believe such and such. Yeah, that would seem to be a different kind of distinction again. That would seem to be a difference between reporting what you believe and reporting what some majority or some group believes. Yeah.
I can't remember the author, but it was this inverted commas sense. It's about the weakness of will, I think. It's one explanation. So, Chris, generally, what's your opinion about the prospect of fictionalism and philosophy? Generally, you seem to be at least theoretically enthusiastic about it. Say this fiction is about philosophical theories. What do you have in mind? Do you have in mind something specific? Some specific philosophical theory?
Well, is this a question for me or?
Yeah. For you, it's what's your plan for your further work? What's your whole picture of fictionalism?
Well, that's I haven't got there yet to think about where it can go from here. It does tie into, I guess, an interest I've had in error theories and defending error theories about particular topics or discourses. So I guess it's nice to use these two notions in tandem. You know, error theories about certain topics, and then a fictionist way, which is a way of preserving talk about that topic. I don't know. I suppose I'll wait for more feedback for this particular paper and this take on fictionalism, and then see how to develop it from there.
It's an interesting notion, center of gravity. Dennett was writing about it. So all physical objects, they have center of gravity, but in a sense, there is no such thing as center of gravity. It's not a thing, something that we calculate. And in a sense, well, we can put the thing in balance and it works and it's good, but in one sense, it's nothing. It does not exist. On the other hand, it obviously exists. So maybe fictionalism is a good candidate for center of gravity.
Yeah. So there are some people who I feel kind of overreact to fictionalism, and they think that you can't draw a distinction between belief and, what's called acceptance. But then I think they face the pressure of saying what they think about examples like yours, about the center of gravity, about cases where it seems like we'd want to be fictionalists, but that requires a belief acceptance distinction, which they don't want. So yeah, I think these kind of examples are quite powerful kind of counter arguments to the opposition. People who think that fictionalism just is completely unviable.
Vito, Danica, Matija.
One short question.
Okay.
What would be limits of fictionalism in philosophy, in your opinion?
So that was, I think, like the last section of the paper, where I suggested that being a fictionalist about philosophical theories themselves is not viable. Why not? Because I say that fictionalism requires that the topic of the fiction has some payoff, as I put it, some kind of identifiable benefit. So, fictionalism about Copernican theory has a benefit because whether or not Copernican theory is true or false, it has the benefit of making certain predictions about planets and their orbits. Okay, in the case of a philosophical theory, say, I don't know, say phenomenalism or Lewis's modal realism, or fill in the examples you like, fictionalism about that philosophical theory isn't viable because that philosophical theory, whether it's true or false, doesn't have any payoff. It doesn't have any utility. So that's one place where I think you can trace the limits of fictionalism. Applies well enough to things like mathematics and morality, not so much to philosophical theories themselves. That's what the case study about grounding and grounding fictionalism was supposed to reveal. What we've got there is a lot of filtering talk about grounding, but it doesn't reveal that grounding talk has any benefit whatsoever. So this philosopher's invention of grounding can't even be justified by saying, oh, well, it's got some practical utility, even if we're not realists about it. That was my thinking there.
Well, I'm afraid that you're maybe proving too much. Yeah, the claim is we cannot be fictionalists about philosophical theories because they don't have a practical payoff.
Yeah.
Strange. Well, you mentioned that these grounding and philosophical explanations, that they are fictions, not only entities, but whole explanations that are fictions. There is this famous one over many argument that tells why things resemble. They resemble because they instantiate the same universals. So this is supposed to be the explanation of their resemblance. I don't know what to think about it. I was working on that and I don't know. But some people would say that, okay, you see, we have a concept of universal entity, very universal, and it's useful. We can explain the resemblance between objects, similarity between objects. It has explanatory value. It's very good concept or category. So one might say, oh, you see, universals have explanatory value. If they have explanatory value, well, they are at least intellectually useful, and that's a reason to accept them. We will think and talk better with them than without them.
Yeah, I guess whether we can think or talk better with them than without them is what would need to be shown. I mean, for one thing, I don't see why the idea of universals would be in better standing than any other idea we've got. So I think, yeah, I think an argument would be needed to show that this is an idea worth exploring. Not just, because thinking in general about things has, I don't know, improves our reasoning skills and our skills in arguing with one another. So yeah, going back to your earlier question about explanation, I take it that someone who's a fictionist about universals will also be a fictionist about explanations in which universals figure. But beside all that, we remain to be convinced, for instance, why the theory of universals has any kind of utility which isn't shared by any other theory about anything else in philosophy. Like say grounding. I mean, that really lowers the bar for utility, I think, because it just means, oh well, we can debate about it and criticize it and sort of flex our intellectual muscles and things. Well, that's true enough. But that doesn't seem to me to be anything that singles out the notion of universals or the notion of grounding.
Well, it seems to me that, Matthew, okay. It seems to me that maybe the notion of species is a good candidate for fictional approach. That will say natural kind or species. Nominalists say, well, I see a horse, I don't see horseness, but maybe the zoologist or botanist, for them it will be good to assume that there are natural kinds, that there are horses, flowers, fishes, and so on. So maybe that might be a good candidate for plausible candidate for fictionalism. Natural kind.
Yeah, absolutely. Or law of nature. Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah, sorry, Mattia did raise a hand, right?
Yeah, I have a question. It's unrelated to the point you're discussing right now. Is it fine, or do you want to? Oh, okay. Thanks. So I just want to quickly go back to the notion of accepting, I don't know, that P versus believing that P, right? Or, acceptance versus belief. So I'm just thinking, and I'm curious about your response. Would you say that there's a difference in the dispositions we can ascribe to an agent who merely accepts that P versus someone who actually believes that P? Would you say there's a difference in dispositions that we can ascribe to these two instances, to these two agents? Or I don't know, what would be your response? This is something I'm usually thinking about when I think about fictionalism and the distinction between acceptance and belief, and I'm not sure what to think of it. So I'm curious what your commentary would be.
Yeah, so I would think that there is a difference in dispositions. I mean, this may not be the kind of difference that kind of excites you or particularly interests you, but there's going to be a difference in their linguistic dispositions. I mean, particularly if the person who accepts is kind of self-conscious. So they will deny that they believe, and they will deny various inferences in which he would have to be believed to get a certain conclusion. So, given the claim, if P then Q, P therefore Q, since the person doesn't believe Q, he may be loath then to draw the conclusion that Q, because that's licensed only by believing P. That won't be something that he'll believe.
Some thought about categorical and dispositional properties. Can one be is that a consistent position to be realist about categorical properties and fictionalist about dispositional properties?
Yeah, I would think so. And I think that people who've been very close to that, I think Goodman, insofar as he believed in categorical bases and properties at all, seems to me to be treating talk of dispositions as just a kind of an expedient reflecting our ignorance of what the categorical bases are. And Quine says similar things in that paper about natural kinds. But just going back to my earlier reply about the difference in linguistic dispositions, I mean, put yourself in the situation of your attitude to talk about centers of gravity. If you don't believe that there are centers of gravity, but you think it's convenient to talk as if there are such things, think as a kind of a thought experiment, how does your behavior differ from someone who would believe it? And, there may not be any kind of glaring differences between them, except for what these people are consciously prepared to say. That if someone writes papers denying that there are centers of gravity and saying, I don't believe that there are such things, we need to come up with a charitable explanation of their behavior. And the most obvious one is that they don't believe that there are centers of gravity. So I do think that there are, not especially interesting, but there are differences in the linguistic dispositions of the believers and the acceptors. It'd be very hard to make sense of the behavior of people like Van Fraassen and Field in writing their books if we were to say, oh yeah, these people really do believe in mathematics or scientific unobservables. And it often, wasn't the case with these linguistic dispositions. There needn't be a crucial test which says what attitude someone has. But from a range of behavior, you might infer what the most plausible explanation of that behavior is. And I would think in some cases, at least, from people's explicit denials that they believe various things, that you might say, yeah, their attitude is more likely to be one of acceptance rather than belief.
There is one cynical comment that many people are soldiers in the war. So, well, statistically, a lot of them are religious. They believe in God, afterlife, and so on. However, when they are in trenches under the grenades, what they pray for, they don't pray for a better place in the afterlife. They pray that a grenade doesn't hit them. So if you, on declarative level, some of them will be religious in the classical sense of the word, but in practice, when you look at their behavior, they're all atheists.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a good example for making distinction between this pretending between what they really believe and what they declare.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a very kind of sensitive and difficult issue to make kind of hard and fast rules about. One reading of the situation is that being under shell fire in their foxhole reveals what they really believed all along.
Yeah.
Another reading might be that the situation has caused them to form certain religious beliefs under the pressure, beliefs that they didn't have before. Which of these is the right story to tell, I think would be a task for, the psychologists and research teams there. And there's kind of a similar kind of issue about tacit belief. Which beliefs do we have that are tacit, and which, what the extent of our tacit beliefs are. So there are certain things we believe tacitly, quite clearly, because we just don't happen to be entertaining them at the time. But in other cases, it's not clear whether we can even be said to have believed them tacitly, because I don't know, they're so unobvious or something like that. So yeah, I agree. There is a kind of a broad issue here about identifying what people's psychology is. And going back to what I said about belief and acceptance, I think there aren't any simple test cases we can use to tell whether someone believes or accepts something, or whether someone believes something tacitly or doesn't believe it at all, or what these soldiers really believed under these different conditions, whether they were pre-existing beliefs or they were beliefs that they formed in those circumstances. So all of these strike me as actually empirical questions, which are interesting to us as philosophers, but we probably can't solve in the armchair.
So it's 7:38. Are there more questions, comments? Okay, I think we can stop here, although we could go on for whole night. Well, thank you very much for giving this lecture. It was a pleasure.
No, well, thanks everyone. That's been really useful to me and very helpful indeed. Thank you. So it's sharpened a lot of my thinking up. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll be in touch. We are
Sure. Yeah.
doing many